This edition of Citizens Club Policy Breakfast is brought to you by Abraham Lincoln Capital Airport, Kerber and Braeckel Asset Management, Maldaner's Restaurant, Michael Higgins, owner, chef, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and through the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Mayor Frank Edwards, who is perhaps unfortunately short-term mayor, doing an excellent job, and the mayor is going to visit with us and answer some questions, and then we'll move toward the Congressman, Aaron Schock. Mayor Edwards?
You want me to take that with me, Bernie, so you don't miss anything? Huh? We ready? Yeah. It's okay. I'll make it real short. Thanks for coming. We'll see you. Don't they always say that's the best thing, is just get in and get out? Well, it's the political season, and I'm having as much fun listening to the rhetoric as y'all. It's kind of fun to see what people are coming up with. We've tried to be as open as we could be. We've put the budget out on the website, let people see it. After we got done with it, we reloaded the budget out there so people could actually see the changes we made. And when this first started, we said government would be smaller when we started than it is today, and it is. We eliminated 65 positions in the budget process. 9 people were sitting in some of those positions, and the alderman wanted to reload those back in. But let me talk a little bit about the 65 positions so you understand what I'm talking about. And I guess it's 56 positions now. When we looked at the budget book, there were a lot of positions that needed to be filled. And you have to give a pat on the back to the previous administration. They hadn't filled those positions. But those positions were still sitting in the books. The salaries were still there. The workers' comp was still there. All the benefit package was still there. The city was still loading the insurance to those positions. So it was as if somebody was in those positions and we wiped them completely off the books and saved considerable amount of money. So today you have a smaller public works department, you have a smaller fire department, and you have a smaller police department. And we'll make that work because we're designing things different and being more efficient with the dollars that we do have. So that is a tremendous amount of money that we removed from the budget, and we did that in about 45 days. We have about another 60 days to go, and if we can do that in 45 days, we're just getting started. We will have a smaller government when we're all done. Some of that by design, some of it because we have to. And City of Springfield is not an employment agency. It's here to serve the people of Springfield in services that we provide. And that's the way we've looked at government today. So it's fun to hear the other candidates, and I'm glad I'm not in the race. This is a lot of fun for me. So, and I've had a lot of people come up and they've been very gracious to me and give me a pat on the back, and I appreciate that. But it's fun for me just as it is for you to sit and listen to the candidates on what they're going to do, because sometimes it's not as easy as they think. We had an automatic form of government today. We had a commission form of government. Let me tell you something, and I've said this before. I actually think that government worked better under the commission form of government than it does today. And my reasoning for that is because somebody was held accountable. If your skirts weren't plowed, you went to the streets commissioner. And, you know, he lived or died on whether he did a good job or not. Today, there seems to be a disconnect on who's accountable. And I think the buck stops at the mayor's office, and we as citizens have not held that position accountable. And that's where we as voters need to change the corner. We need to listen to what our candidates are saying, and if they're saying that and they're not doing it, we need to hold them accountable. I think the days of just letting politicians say what they want to say is over with. So I'll kind of let it go at that, but that's how I feel about it. We've tried to be open. We've tried to keep things above board. I obviously have not hired anybody. I'm not going to hire anybody. Let me rephrase that. I did hire Steve Dove, Bernie, before you write that in there. I did hire Steve Dove, and let me tell you why I hired Steve Dove. Everybody just thinks that I needed an assistant. Well, I did need an assistant, but what we did is, if you'll remember the very first time I took office, I told everybody that we'll have people leaving offices and we're going to need some help up there in the front office. I heard some of the aldermen say, well, the directors will help you. Well, we're having directors leave. We've had the director of CWLP leave. We've had an attorney leave. Ken Crutcher, who's the head of OBM, just left. So Steve Dove will now shift over and focus a little bit on OBM. And a lot of people don't know this, but when we get contracts and stuff, you have two signatures on those contracts. One is from the guy from OBM. The other guy's the mayor. I can't sign twice. So what we did was Steve will now shift over and do some of the work that Ken Crutcher's. He's been working with Ken Crutcher the last week or so, the week and a half, to get up on speed. And he'll leave a lot of work in the mayor's office, and I'll pick up majority of that work. So that's why we designed it, to help pick up the load when people are leaving, because we felt that we should leave those positions to the next mayor to really fill. So, and I still feel like that. So without any further ado, I have more fun when people ask questions. And I will say this, I think our guys did an absolutely fabulous job with the blizzard. They spent a lot of time out there, and I think they did a great job. You know, we're not perfect. There's about probably 5% that we didn't catch. It took us a little longer to get to, but all in all, I think our guys did a great job in the blizzard. So other than that, I'll leave it for questions if somebody's got.
Two questions.
Well, that was easy. Well, there's two schools of thought on that. One was we started with a $10 million deficit. We eliminated 60 positions, and we think over the next year you're going to have some attrition, so we'll have more positions that will be available to use as money. And I told the council that we've shifted with raises that are due in contracts and the shifting of the two money. We're starting out next fiscal year with $4 million in the hole. Well, it was 4.3. We've since decreased that because we didn't feel that the citizens of this town should pay twice for something. So when the alderman reloaded the monies back into the system to keep those people hired, we also used some of that money to pay down some of that debt. So that debt, we wiped out like $300,000. So that debt now stands at about $400,000. Half of that is about raises and fringe benefits for employees. So we shifted $2 million from this year to next year. That equates into 41 more positions. Now, are we going to be able to downsize to 41 positions? No. But it allows us the time to do an audit on every position with every director and do a systematic downsize of government rather than just go in there and haphazard and start cutting people. So that's why we shifted the extra $2 million to the next year, so that we would have the next 60 days to give an audit. One of the things that we're doing too over the next 60 days is we're writing a manual on what we've done, how we did it, what we think, what's in the contract, what contracts are coming due, kind of like an owner's manual. So the next person coming through the door, we're going to hand them that book, and we'll go over to them in detail what we think, how that can be resolved, and what we can do to resolve that. We also think that we're beginning to see a little uptick in the economy, especially when we get the skills. So the city will be better equipped to handle that extra $2 million, because really, if we hadn't done that, we would have laid off 41 more people to pay off that debt. And we think that it's better to downsize in an orderly fashion rather than just come through with a scalpel and start cutting. So I understand your concerns, but that's how we looked at it in the long range.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
I'm going to slip out this way so I can watch.
Okay. We are very, very pleased to have Congressman Aaron Schock with us this morning. Aaron is, I was going to say, still the youngest congressman. I don't know if that's the right way to say that or not, but anyway, serving in Congress, is the youngest member of Congress, is from the 18th district, which covers about half of Sangamon County, as we know. And it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Aaron Schock this morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and I appreciate the invitation by Mr. Gray and the accommodation that the mayor has made to allow me to share the stage with him this morning. We're fresh back from a exciting week in Washington, D.C., and next week it's going to look like it's going to be even maybe more exciting than the last. This would be filed under the old adage, be careful what you wish for. If you watched C-SPAN, I'm sure all of you watch C-SPAN every day, right, and watch what the House of Representatives is doing. For the first time since I've been in Congress, we operated under what they call an open rule. And what that basically means is that anybody can offer any amendment that's germane to the legislation. A Republican or a Democrat, a freshman member or the most senior member really has equal power under an open rule. And it's the strength of a good idea, if you will. Well, the result of that was last week over 80 hours of debate. On Thursday night, we finished at 3 in the morning on the House floor. Friday, it was about 1:30 in the morning. And on Saturday, the final vote was at 5 a.m. So being the youngest member sometimes comes in handy when you're operating in those hours late in the night and early in the morning. I'm going to just give you a brief update on what's been happening in Congress for the first 2 months, and then I really want to throw it open for questions because I'm here to get your perspective on what's going on in Washington and perhaps give me some good ideas as I head back next week. All of you know that after the first week that Congress was in session, we had the very unfortunate incident with my colleague Gabrielle Giffords being shot. The following week, Congress really was in a holding pattern as the Capitol Police really assessed the threat to all of us, and we didn't really begin legislating then until the third week. What has been consuming most of our time, and you've been reading about, really is this continuing resolution, the funding of government. And I want to just kind of walk you through that process because, quite frankly, it's a bit confusing to new members of Congress, and I know it's confusing to most taxpayers that aren't involved with it on a day-to-day basis. Typically, Congress passes a budget. The fiscal year starts October 1 of the calendar year, and last year, Congress failed to pass a budget. And this was the first time since the 1974 Budget Act that Congress failed to pass a budget. And so as a result of Congress failing to do its work last year, the majority then simply passed what they called continuing resolutions, which is basically spending authority for a given period of time at the current levels. So we would vote on them, for example, a month at a time. In some cases, it was 2 or 3 months at a time. The last vote was towards the end of last year, and it authorized spending at current levels until March 4th, which is next Friday. And so as a result, the new Congress is being charged with coming up with spending authority for the remaining 7 months until October 1st of later this year. And so this is really the first opportunity that the new Congress is having to vote on any spending authority. And many of the new congressmen and some of the ones who've been there for a term or two and even longer believe this is an opportunity for us to first begin to make the cuts that many of us believe have to happen in order for us to right-size the budget. We have a $1.6 trillion deficit. And the President, for example, has talked about in his State of the Union a spending freeze. And many of us, myself included, do not believe that is sufficient, simply because if you're running a $1.6 trillion deficit and you freeze it, you're still spending a $1.6 trillion deficit. So we have to make cuts. Some have asked me, well, Aaron, you know, the $100 billion off the president's proposed budget that you all cut last week in the House's version is but a shaving of the $1.6 trillion deficit. $100 billion isn't going to solve it. Well, you're right, but I would point out a couple things. Number one, this is not a budget. This is a continuing resolution. And much of the programmatic funding begins in the fiscal year, the start of the fiscal year. For example, grant programs, where local communities will apply for the funding. That money is already on its way out the doors and has already been awarded. In some cases, the checks have been written. And so the ability for the Congress to recapture those funds is very limited. We're basically dealing with about 15% of the budget that we can cut right now through the remaining 7 months. So it was very difficult for us to get a large amount of money, keeping in mind we need to keep some services going. We can't cut everything. And so that's where the $100 billion off of the president's proposed budget came. Nothing was sacred during this process. As I mentioned, it was an open rule. And so there were over 400 amendments filed. Over 120 of these amendments passed. Some of them the Republican leadership wanted. Some of them the Republican leadership didn't want. And even though they controlled the House of Representatives, they let the will of the majority prevail. For example, there were many on my side of the aisle who said, you know what, we need to cut discretionary funding, but we shouldn't cut defense. The continuing resolution that passed the House cut, as it was introduced, $16 billion in the next 7 months from the Department of Defense. There was an additional amendment that was offered up that I supported that my speaker did not like, which was an amendment to strike funding for a second engine that the Pentagon and the Defense Secretary said was not necessary. But some in our conference believed we needed anyways. And that bill passed and added another $3 billion in cuts in defense. So it was $19 billion in defense spending cuts over the next 7 months. So nothing was sacred, everything was on the table, and really the will of the majority in the House prevailed to come up with just over $100 billion in reductions from the president's proposed budget. Well, as you know, the House is not the king, and we are but one of 3 legs in the stool. And so we need to work with the Senate, and finally we need to work with the President. And so there have been some of my friends on the Senate side who've been very critical and very, you know, have offered up their critique of what the House has done. And what I would say to our senators is, please bring me your alternative. Bring us your better ideas. Bring us your continuing resolution that answers the call of the American people, which is spend less, bring the government spending under control. And perhaps you can do it better. And so we're waiting for the Senate really to come forward with an alternative proposal to the continuing resolution that the House has done. And I'm certain that their version will be different than the House's version, and there will need to be some melding in conference committee and some compromise that is necessary. It's yet to be seen what's going to happen in the next week, because we can move quick when we need to, but Congress is notorious for moving slowly. And so I'm not putting my money on the House's version passing the Senate this next week when I go back to Washington, D.C. But I'm hopeful that the Senate makes progress, and there's the potential of a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government running, because many of us do not want a government shutdown while we work out a negotiation with the Senate. Once we resolve the continuing resolution for the next 7 months, then what you're going to see us do is introduce a budget by about April or May, and hopefully be able to pass that budget by the end of June or midsummer, so that it's ready to go by October. The budget process, of course, will be much more involved. This is the opportunity really for the appropriators to do their job, to go in line item by line item, to hold hearings and bring in the bureaucrats and have them justify their budget. And you're going to see substantial cuts far above what we proposed in the continuing resolution last week when we proposed the full budget after the appropriation process has been able to work its will. The other major financial vote you're going to hear about is the debt limit, which is set to expire at some point this early spring, March or April. We are nearing the $14 trillion debt limit. And this will be another opportunity. First, let me say, I think it would be a disaster for us to hit the debt limit and for us not to raise the debt limit. And I don't have time to go into all of the ramifications, but this would not just affect the federal government defaulting on its payment of bills and obligations, but it would directly affect every taxpayer's interest rates and quality of life. And so for many reasons, it's a reality of what we have to do as a result of overspending. And many of us believe in order for us to vote for a extension of the debt limit, we're going to have to get some cuts and some concessions as a part of raising that debt limit. So you're going to hear that discussion after the continuing resolution. There will be a debt limit vote and then the budget at some point this summer. In the meantime, some of the policies that we're working on that I personally will be working on as a new member of the Ways and Means Committee, which is the Tax Writing Committee, the Trade Committee. We deal with all the entitlements. Will be first and foremost tax reform. We've begun hearings. We've had about 3 hearings so far. We've got good bipartisan support. Both Dave Camp, who's the chairman of the committee, and Sandy Levin, who's the ranking member, have agreed, the Republicans and Democrats on the committee, to again leave everything on the table. This is everything from the mortgage interest deduction to the charitable deduction to the sugar beet credit to the ethanol subsidy, you name it, all the carve-outs that help different segments of the population. We believe that it would be in the best interest of the public to get rid of a lot of those carve-outs and lower the overall basis and tax rate that we all pay. That would not only make it fairer, but it also make it simpler for you to be able to do your taxes and hopefully make us more competitive in the international markets as well with a lower overall rate. Tax reform is going to probably take a year or two. The President has talked about his interest in doing it. I would suggest that it's most likely going to happen either at the conclusion of his reelection, in other words, the beginning of his second term, similar to what happened with Reagan in the 80s, or perhaps the beginning of a new president's term, depending on how the election works out. But in the meantime, the Congress, the House is really charged with coming up with what that proposal for tax simplification, tax reform should look like. The other major initiative we're working on that we hope to get legislation this year is on trade agreements. I'm on the trade subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee. The President has come forward with the South Korean agreement. This will be a huge boon to my congressional district, the large agricultural presence. Agriculture is the #1 employer in my district. Number 2 is manufacturing, and both the manufacturing base as well as the grown goods in my district will largely benefit from new markets, new customers around the world. We're hopeful, and we had Ambassador Ron Kirk, the President's trade ambassador, in the committee last week, and I had the opportunity to ask him not only about South Korea, but also Colombia and Panama as well, which are 2 other markets and 2 other opportunities that I hope we can put together with South Korea and advance later this year. And the President, and through his trade ambassador, said that's his goal as well, so we're hopeful that that will happen later this year. So those are kind of the 2 big picture issues. I want to kind of, before I open it up, I want to go through a little bit of where we are with the budget. So I brought a few slides along because I think sometimes pictorials are a little bit better. So to show you how this is unsustainable, this is our historic trend of debt. You can see back from 1941 during World War II. This is the debt held by public as a percent of the gross domestic product, GDP. And you can see where we are here in 2010. And this is based on the President's proposed budget. So right now we just have the President's proposed budget that he released. These are numbers that are coming from the Congressional Budget Office. And this is where we are in 2010 as a percent of GDP. Based on the President's proposed budget, as it's introduced, this is what would happen to our debt as a percent of GDP. So you can see what my concern is with the President's budget. This is another slide that illustrates the actual deficit amounts that we've had. starting back under 2004, which was the largest deficit under the Bush administration, which was just over $400 billion. And then you saw it start to creep down, and then when the economy crashed, it shot up to well over $400 billion again in 2008. But in 2009, we set a record, which was $1.4 trillion. Now, these bars represent the proposed deficits under the latest budget released by the President. If we enacted the President's budget as it is introduced, we would have to raise $1.6 trillion in new taxes, and even with $1.6 trillion in new taxes, if we pass them all, this is the level of debt we would incur on each one of these years. Over a 10-year period, we would over double the nation's deficit. In other words, we would accrue more debt over the next 10 years than we have since the founding of our country. Now, obviously people say, well, you got to do something about it. You got to cut. So I think it's important to show where we're spending our money. Because as I mentioned in my opening, we made some cuts in the continuing resolution, but it's very hard to get at the root cause without dealing with the major cost drivers. This pie chart represents the overall spending of the federal budget. You have mandatory spending, which is just what it suggests. It's not by choice year to year. And then you have discretionary spending, which you can play around with more from year to year. When you look at what we spend in $3.5 trillion in federal spending on an annualized period, your Social Security amounts to $700 billion rather. Medicare, Medicaid, your interest on the debt right now is $200 billion, which is about as low as it's going to get because our interest rates are extremely low, and then other mandatory spending. So if you look at what mandatory spending, which is entitlement spending, it takes up well over half of the pie chart. Then you go into discretionary spending. This is everything from education dollars to highway dollars to funding for the arts, you name it. That's $666 billion, and then our total for defense is $692 billion. So you can see that when we're talking about cutting and reining in the federal deficit, that we can't deal with this unless we deal with entitlements, which is why you've heard the President and the Republican leadership both say that our budgets have to deal with the entitlements. We're growing at an unsustainable rate. Let me show you another graph that kind of... So this black line here is the revenue from our taxes, okay? This is how much of that revenue we spent on Social Security over the years. This is how much we've spent on Medicaid. This is how much we've spent on Medicare. So in 2010, you can see we're right here. This is how much we're spending on entitlements, and that's how much we have to play with. And as with no changes, as the years progress, that line starts to shrink, and our discretionary pot begins to shrink, and by about 2045, if no changes are made, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will consume 100% of every dollar we collect. So obviously, we can't spend 100% of what we collect in our government on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and obviously if nothing's done, we will begin running pretty severe deficits as a result. So this problem is not going to go away overnight, and it's going to take some hard choices, both for members of Congress to have to vote on, but more importantly for our public to share their view of what they'd like to see done. Many of us believe, myself included, that anything that's done with Social Security, Medicare, or any of the entitlements should not affect those that are 55 years of age or older. And so both the Democrat and Republican proposals that are out there to address this issue right now are all designed around attacking this problem for those under the age of 55. The irony here is sometimes people come up to me and say, no, wait a minute, don't touch my Social Security, don't touch my Medicaid or my Medicare. The reality is if you're under the age of 55, as this chart suggested, and nothing is done, you don't have to worry about somebody touching your Social Security or Medicare because they're not going to be there. So at the end of the day, you know, we have to do something, and so and it's going to need to be a bipartisan solution. No party's going to own it. No party is going to solve it by themselves, and certainly with the current makeup of the Congress and the President, it's going to take us both working together, and I'm encouraged by the President and the Speaker both saying they want to work together on it. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions on any of the happenings out in Washington, D.C. We have a little bit different schedule this year than we did my first term in Congress. For those of you, again, that watch our sessions, pretty much last year, we were in session almost every week during the week. And we set a record in the House for the most number of days in session. So I kind of joked that perhaps that correlated with spending the most amount of money we've ever spent, being in session the most number of days. But I'm excited that this year we've got more district work periods, so I'm able to come back, address groups like yourself, and get around to the constituents that I represent and serve. So I genuinely want your thoughts and ideas, and whether it's here today or when I'm out in Washington, D.C., there's no more powerful lobbyist that comes in my door that calls me than my constituents. And so I would just encourage you to keep in touch as these things progress and to give me a piece of your mind. With that, let's have some questions. Yes?
Is the war in Iraq and Iran included in that defense piece, or is that more on the non-variable piece of the spending process?
We have been funding the war now through well, the first year we had a budget. Last year we didn't. So the continuing resolution basically funds everything at its current levels. There have been, prior to me arriving to Congress, under the Bush administration, there was basically off-budget appropriation bills that passed. That's not happened since the Obama administration. Yes.
Good morning, Aaron. I'm just interested in knowing what your stance is on the current high-speed rail project as it goes from Chicago to St. Louis, and also the proposed funding for additional ARA funds to support the high-speed rail crossing.
Well, we've been working with the local Chamber of Commerce and the elected officials here in Springfield and with the Department of Transportation to find the most agreed upon path. As you figure out real quick in elected service, in any decision making, you're not going to make everybody happy. But at the end of the day, my job as representatives to support the will of the public, and so it seems to be there's a consensus around one of those paths through Springfield. With regards to the funding, obviously this is, you know, when we talk about high speed, I'm always very slow first to explain when we're talking high speed, because high speed in Illinois means something different than high speed along the Eastern Corridor. You know, when we're talking about some of the high speed investments on the Eastern Corridor, we're talking about rail lines that, quite frankly, mirror something you'd ride in Europe, going a couple hundred miles an hour between many of the major cities on the Eastern Corridor of the United States. When we're talking about high speed rail in the Midwest, we're talking about upgrading the current freight line rails so that we can go about 90 plus miles per hour, which is different. It is higher speed, but you know, if I had a magic wand, I'd like to see something similar to what we've got on the East Coast with a couple hundred miles an hour. But obviously the investment would be significant. So I'm supportive of what's happening in Illinois, and you know, the President has made this a priority. And so we have to make sure, however, that whether it's in my district or whether it's in another district, that there's a cost-benefit analysis done to ensure that the dollars being invested warrant the investment, and that over the long term, it becomes financially solvent and isn't a burden to future taxpayers. And quite frankly, there's a simple reality with our country in that we don't have the density of population that some of our European and Asian counterparts have that warrant true high-speed rail. The high-speed rail, for example, like the LEV in Shanghai, which goes, I believe, well over 300 miles per hour, costs about $1 billion a mile to build. Well, when you're connecting a city of 20 million to a city of 10 million, and they're a couple hundred miles apart, It makes sense. The population density suggests it. If you're in the United States and you're trying to cross a state like Illinois or Iowa or Montana to connect a city of a couple 100,000 to a couple 100,000 city, it simply doesn't make sense. So I know that the cost-benefit analysis is done for the upgrade from Chicago to Springfield, and I support that. But we have to be careful as we make these investments around the country that they truly warrant the kind of money that would be required. Yes?
Aaron, I've been reading that one of the major problems that we're having in Afghanistan is that if we pull out, Pakistan's liable to fall, and they have atomic capabilities. Can you address anything about that?
Well, you've stated a fact. So,
I mean, is that concern in D.C.? I haven't heard anything out of there. Why?
well, I think I think some of the leaders are cautious about talking about our fears for obvious reasons. So, I mean, it's something that we've certainly talked about. I've been in the room when it's been talked about. We get briefings. They're classified briefings by the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Mike Mullen, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they go over what's going on in the regions and what their concerns are, and that's definitely a concern. So I think the President, to his credit, is going to be continuing to assess our progress in Afghanistan. Clearly, he felt the best path when he was elected, shortly after he was elected, was to increase the troop levels, to try and infiltrate, similar to what we did in Iraq. When I visited the troops last holiday season, I will tell you that the mood over there was one that was very positive. But as I traveled Afghanistan, I often wondered whether or not we can infiltrate a people that in some cases are very, very uneducated, and there doesn't seem to be the willingness there that there may have been, for example, in Iraq. But I certainly don't have as much information as generals on the field. I don't have as much information as the commander-in-chief, so I won't be making the decision. But I think there will be, one of the things the President's going to have to consider is whether or not we keep the type of special forces and limited troops that were there under much of the Bush administration, or whether we continue with the more beefed-up approach that has been implemented under the current administration. But in either case, I don't think you're going to see us completely disappear for that region for two reasons. Number one, for the potential increase in terrorism back in Afghanistan, and perhaps number two, because of the stability in the region. If we were to completely pull out and have no presence, what it would mean for their neighbors, chief among them, Pakistan. Yes?
Congressman, I think there's some general understanding as to why budgets and spending at the federal level has to be cut. But as I look through the House version, there are a number of programs being cut that were originally placed there, that spending to offset federal mandates, requirements, regulations that states and localities had to carry out. But what we're not hearing is a lot about whether there's some formal effort going on in the Congress to roll those back if the cuts are going to be made. In fact, what we're seeing in Congress even now is that, or at the federal levels, additional requirements, the new ozone standards being proposed, for example, places another cost on localities. So I was just wondering whether there was going to be some formal or, approach, particularly among the Republican members in the House, to look at some of those kinds of issues. Because I think you'd find a lot of state and local partners that would love to work with you.
Well, I'd love to work with you, and to the degree you have specific ideas on some provisions that we could eliminate or stop the implementation of that would save you money, bring them forward. Because I'm definitely interested in working on those issues, and I know the majority I serve with is. Some of the amendments that passed to the continuing resolution did not add any money, did not cut any money, but said something as simple as no money in this bill, in other words, no money being appropriated for the next 7 months, can be used to administer X, or can be used to enforce X. And so basically, through the appropriation process, which is, I would argue, one of the most powerful things the House has, because Article 1 of the Constitution gives the power of the purse to the Congress, and they all have to start in the House, is that we can, through the appropriation process, stop the the bureaucrats or the unelected officials from making some of the rule-making provisions that they've made. In other words, enforcing some of their rules. The EPA, for example, I don't have a list of them with me, but there were several amendments that dealt with air quality issues and so on that they were unilaterally making decisions on that the Congress had not voted on. So if you have some specific ideas on that, I am all ears and definitely believe that's going to be a priority. Yes?
Thank you. Authoritative leaders or dictators in Africa and Middle East are falling apart and they're losing their dictatorship position. Having said that, how that's going to affect us in our deficit or in our relation with another countries? A, are we going to help them build a democratic society? Are we going to be involved? B, if we don't do that, are they going to be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think you raise a great question, and I think it's one that the administration's been struggling with. I mean, here you really have organic uprisings by the people. That's not to say that there aren't people in our country who support the efforts in these countries, but to the degree our governments have been funding the uprisings as we have done in other countries in past times, these are really efforts that are organic by the people. And so, to your point, it's important that we support movements towards democracy. Obviously, many of us are cautious because we want to make sure that, we'd like to make sure at least that whomever is elected is truly for democracy and will not establish some kind of a religious state that will suppress freedom and liberty, which seems to be the motive behind these democratic movements. I'm not sure, though, that we can ensure that a country is democratic. It has to be the people that are willing to do that. And we've seen that even in Iraq after we've pulled back troops, that it's really been up to the people there to have to work out their constitution. We can't write it for them. And the same to be true in countries like Egypt and others. I think what we have to make sure is that there's space and there's time for alternatives to develop. One of the truisms with these regimes that you're talking of is that they've done a good job of suppressing alternatives, suppressing democratic movements. And so in the case of Egypt, the really only alternative that's organized is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is something that many of us believe would be dangerous if they were the ones who took over that government eventually. So between now and currently the elections, which are scheduled in September, you're right, we need to make sure that the adequate amount of support is there for alternative groups and alternative candidates to be able to organize and get their message out, so that at the end of the day the voters do have an opportunity to elect a democratic president or leader in the case of Egypt in September. So this is not an easy solution, but I think that we have to be mindful that these people are wanting their freedom, they're wanting their liberty, and at the end of the day, that's what our country stands for. And to the degree that we don't have to fight for that for someone, but that they're willing to fight for it themselves, it makes it a lot easier for us to help them. Yes.
Representative, in light of those uprisings and the people who study those kind of things in the last 48 hours have been forecasting $5 a gallon at the pump by Memorial Day, is there anything the Congress can do or intends to do to push the administration towards taking our crude supplies out of Anwar, out of the shale in the west, or perhaps offshore drilling, all of which they've said, no, we can't do that, we'll continue to be held up by these people over the Mideast?
Short answer is yes. You will see the Congress do that. I mean, the reality is this. When the Department of Energy was established under the Nixon administration, it was given the sole charge of making the United States less energy dependent on foreign sources. 30 years later, we are now more dependent on foreign sources than we were when the DOE was established. So for anybody that thinks we need more government in order to solve this problem, I might suggest that they are precisely why we have less domestic energy supply, or less domestic energy in the marketplace. look, there's going to be votes on oil, both in ANWR, offshore leasing. Those votes are going to take place in the House. I'm going to support them. The criticism, of course, will be, well, it will be years before we get that oil. Well, that was the debate 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and had we started drilling, we would have the oil now, number one. Number two, like any market, they respond to perceived market conditions, both positive and negative, and if we begin drilling domestically, that will have an impact on the price of oil around the country, even around the world, even before the oil comes on supply, or comes on the market, just knowing in anticipation that that's going to happen. However, so I'm all for domestic production of oil. However, we can't become completely independent of oil, even if we start drilling everywhere. We have a ton of reserves in shale now. We are able to get it out of, and we need to be aggressive in that. But we also need to find ways to diversify how we consume energy. And some of the things that I'm very interested in working on are, number one, we can become electricity independent as a country. We have the ability to do that, much like France and other European countries have. If we invest in nuclear power, we do not have to buy our electricity from Canada and some of our neighbors who are friendly, but it's money that can stay in our country. To the degree we become electricity independent vis-a-vis nuclear and solar and wind, we don't have to burn natural gas to produce electricity, and instead, with our huge and abundant natural gas reserves, we can look to that as a source for transportation fuel, which I think is something that can become a true reality for a number of reasons. Number one, we already have a built-in national distribution system. Every community in America, practically, almost every home in America has natural gas running to it. And so converting that at fueling stations, as well as the potential for home fueling stations, is a reality. And so there are car companies already developing natural gas vehicles, more so on the West Coast. I know in particular in California, I visited a place where they have these. So to the degree we can become less crude oil dependent and more dependent on a source of energy that is readily available in our country, will make that job easier. But the reality is, Congress has had our government has no energy plan. This issue is addressed by Congress only when gas prices skyrocket, and then when they fall, you know, the bird goes back in the cage and nobody really says anything, and then when it goes back up, everybody starts squawking again. So the only thing I would ask, quite frankly, is as taxpayers and as citizens, if you're concerned about this, that you could keep the pressure on not only me, but your other elected officials, because we are a function of who we represent. And if every time I come home, I hear about energy and I hear about the need for us to become more energy independent, to drill, to invest in nuclear and the like, then that's a message I can carry back to Washington, D.C. But unfortunately, when the public stops talking about it, then the members of Congress stop focusing on it, and I would suggest that's why we're in the situation we're in. Sam?
Is the government going to shut down in a week from today? And if not, how are the parties going to come to an agreement then?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I truly believe that both sides genuinely don't want to shut down. But I would say this, there's going to have to be some compromise, and that's coming from the Republican side and from the Democratic side. So what I fear is if either side draws a line in the sand and says, my way or the highway, there probably will be a shutdown. If House Republicans say, only if the Senate passes our continuing resolution with $100 billion in cuts, will we vote for a continuing resolution. I don't think we're going to get that, and I think if we held out for that, there would be a shutdown. Likewise, if the president says, you know what, we need to take the next 7 months to come up with a budget. In the meantime, let's just continue the CR at the current levels. We'll freeze spending for the next 7 months. I don't think that with all the will in my body, I could get enough of the members on my side on the House to vote for a spending freeze. I think most of our members believe there has to be some cuts. That's what the public expects, and so on. So to the degree that we can get both sides to come somewhere towards the center, I think there can be a compromise. I'm not confident it's going to happen this next week. I hope it will, but there may have to be a 1 week CR or a 2 week CR in order for us to finally get that compromise for the next 7 months. Yes?
Congressman, I'm old enough to remember when the highest marginal tax rate in our country was 91%. And not only did the Sun manage to come up every day, we built the interstate highway system and space program that started. So I'm wondering if you have any concerns about the growing inequality of income in our country and the lack of progressivity in our tax system.
Sure. Well, I'd be lying if I told you I remember when the tax rates were 91%. But I have studied a little history. And the reality is when the tax rates were at 90%, we collected very little money among those at 90%. And the reality is when the rates were actually reduced, we collected more revenue because there was less tax sheltering going on and so on. So the reality is there is a law of diminishing return. I mean, at some point, you can't cut taxes to zero, and you can't have taxes at 100% because eventually there's positive and negative reactions, both in terms of revenue as well as in how much taxes you're going to collect. I am concerned that America's middle class is struggling to keep up with the middle class of the rest of the countries of our like size in the nation, in the world. And I think that for us to continue to grow as a country and for us to continue to have opportunity for people in America, we have to remain competitive in the world. And I think one of the most dangerous things for us to do is to put in place tax provisions or mandates that will drive employers to other countries. At the end of the day, most of the innovation in the world happens in our country. Most of the new products in the world are launched in our country. And I think we definitely have to step back and say, why is that? Well, it's because currently we're still the favored place to invest. We're still the favored place to grow. And only in America do you see people who have great entrepreneurial ambition and ideas be able to start that idea and grow it to a huge industry. You don't see Microsofts, you don't see Apples, you don't see YouTubes or Google, you don't see Facebooks, you don't see any of these inventions being developed in other countries. Rather, they're being developed here in our country. And the opportunities that go with them benefit the masses, benefit the middle class. So I don't think the solution to helping the middle class is putting mandates on employers, on jacking up wage scales that put us at a competitive disadvantage. I think it has to be far more organic. I believe to the degree that we create an environment where entrepreneurialism, where investment, where savings is encouraged in our country, that will help everybody in our country. We do need a safety net, and I think that's one of the things that many of us who are trying to rein in the deficit have to keep in mind. Things like Social Security shouldn't go away. Things like Medicare shouldn't go away. Even in discretionary spending, aid to community health clinics that provide health care to the poor. We can't line item out that stuff. It has to be responsible cutting, responsible cutbacks, because at the end of the day, we do have a responsibility to the least among us in our society. And to do our best to provide to them in a responsible way, but also to make sure that there's always that incentive for people to become self-sufficient.
One more.
One more.
Hi, Catherine Stillman. Did I hear you say, are you going to rewrite the tax act, or are you going to reform the tax act? Or not
Well,
you personally, but you collectively.
I would say this. What has happened right now is, as you all know, we passed an extension of current rates for 2 years. And so in 2 years, the current rates expire, many of the credits go away. Actually, some of the credits begin going away in a year. But so really it's an opportunity that comes along but once in a decade or two, where everything's expiring. And so as a result, what the committee has talked about is, rather than all of us running out and saying, because here's what's universal, we all would like a lower overall rate. We don't like the fact that now that Japan has lowered its tax rate, that the United States will have the highest corporate rate in the world. And that means every country is a tax haven to multinational companies. We don't think that makes us competitive, and that's on both sides. The president has talked about that. The Republicans and Democrats in the committee have talked about that. So if your overall goal is to lower the marginal rates without truly having a huge negative impact on the deficit, you got to get rid of some of those credits that cost money. And so all of us have our favorite credits, right? I mean, if you represent the sugar beet growers, you like the sugar beet credit. And if you have a bunch of ethanol plants in your district, you like the ethanol subsidy. I mean, there's hundreds of these. So the only thing that's fair from the committee standpoint is to say, look, we're going to keep them all on the table. And we're going to start by saying, if we got rid of everything, what could the rate be? And then there's going to be some, not speaking beforehand, but I know one, for example, that's going to get a lot of support, I think, is the charitable deduction. Simply because there's many of us who believe without the charitable deduction, our society would look a lot different. And it would require government to play a larger role in the service of social service agencies and faith-based organizations that deliver great service in our communities, but rely on that charitable deduction to raise a lot of the revenue that they use and need. So to say that we're rewriting it completely, I would say right now there's a blank slate. And so right now, that's why we're using the luxury of time for the next 2 years to have these hearings. And the chairman's been very aggressive. I mean, we've been in Congress 2 months, and we've had 3 hearings already on this issue, and bringing in everyone from the tax world, the investment planning world, to the CBO budget guys at the federal level, large companies that do business around the world, asking what is it, what do you think is a fair tax system? So we're trying to get all the players around the table right now to get some of the best ideas before we come up with what that whiteboard is going to fill in with. So if you got some good ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Congressman?
Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank the mayor for joining us this morning, the congressman for joining us this morning, and please try to get here March 25th for our forum on the mayoral race, and thank you for coming this morning.
This edition of Citizens Club Policy Breakfast is brought to you by Abraham Lincoln Capital Airport, Kerber Braeckel Asset Management, Maldaner's Restaurant, Michael Higgins, owner, chef, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and through the support of viewers like you. Thank you.